Good afternoon. My name is Mazen. I'm from Beirut. And today I would like to talk to you about our experience in the Middle East, in Arab countries, about nonviolent resistance. I hope it will be useful. My speech will be brief and it will contain some philosophy, some Middle Eastern political context, and finally some information about a new project happening in Lebanon, which is the University of Nonviolence. We're very excited about it, and we'll mention it briefly towards the end. Behind me there will be some pictures. I would like to begin. So, why are we having a discussion? Nonviolence versus violence. Everyone should know that nonviolence is more ethical than violence. It's quite obvious. However, the power of the supporters of violent change accuse us, nonviolent activists, that we are romantic, we're idealistic, but we can't get things done. So the main accusation against nonviolence is that it's a beautiful idea, however it's not practical, violence is more practical. And this idea is inherently wrong, and this is what I would like to prove today. Nonviolence is a worldview, it's a philosophy, it's a strategy that actually aims to fight oppression and win. It's strategic, it's smart, and it's powerful. So it's both ethical and effective. This is the famous, the gun you saw, it's a famous symbol of nonviolence. Let's move to the next slide. So some context of history. Gandhi is the most famous figure of nonviolence in the world, but Gandhi didn't always know what to do. He learned along the way. One of his teachers was Tolstoy, the famous Russian author. In one public letter by Tolstoy, he was asking himself, or asking the Hindus, how can 30,000 British troops control 200 million Indians? It cannot be done by force alone. It's impossible. Tolstoy concluded that the Indians have agreed to be oppressed. They are cooperating with the oppressor, and therefore the only thing they need to do to liberate is to withdraw their obedience. And this is a major lesson of nonviolent resistance. There is a huge power in numbers, and once numbers come together and withdraw obedience collectively, this is the key word, collectively, then any regime would fall. So moving from Tolstoy, please next slide. So Gandhi, once he learned that important message, what he did is he tried to unite the Indian people behind the message. One of the famous activities he did, events, it's called the Salt March, where he marched throughout India, passing through villages, gathering supporters, going to the Indian Ocean just to pick up salt from the sea as an act of disobedience against the English laws, which had an exclusive right to use the salt of the Indian Ocean. And with that simple act, salt, he managed to gather lots of supporters and collectively withdraw obedience, and eventually they won their freedom. Similarly, the same exact lesson has been adopted in the Arab Spring, at least in the early stages. This is a picture from Egypt, Tahrir Square. And basically the military, the regime had a more powerful army. Of course, they had an army, they had the media, they had everything. But people suddenly decided we can communicate. And this was helped by Facebook. Suddenly, the regimes didn't have an exclusive grip on media. Activists could communicate in other means. So once they could communicate, they called for a big protest on 25th of January 2011, and this was the scene, millions of people in public square refusing to leave, and eventually the regime could not fight back, and it was toppled. There are other reasons why it later on failed, but we will not have time to discuss this today. Next slide, please. So this is also from Egypt. So the power of nonviolence is that it really, think of it that there are four main players on the table. There are us, the activists, there is the police, security opponents, and there are the public opinion and the media. So basically, we are competing, we and the police, and the security state are competing to win over the media and public opinion. And whoever wins over these two important stakeholders will win the political battle, even if they lose the military one. So by this image, for example, this young man is sending a very strong message internally and externally to the whole world. that they are a non-violent movement who are oppressed, who are demanding their rights, and who deserve their rights. And once they do this, the regime and all the military advantages they have are useless. So these tactics neutralize the advantages of the opponent. Next slide, please. So as I said, the goal of non-violent activists is to build communities so that they can collectively affect the outcome of any conflict. Who gets in power, who leaves power, and so on. This is a map of Iraq on the screen, and I was there a few years ago. I was giving a training workshop, and I learned something very interesting, which I would like to share with you. As you see on the screen, there are different provinces of Iraq. When Saddam Hussein was in power, he had a very interesting policy in place, which was passed using the excuse of civic planning. So in his policy, it says that within each province, the cars of that province, on the license plate, they have the name Iraq, Baghdad, Iraq, Basra, so on. It was illegal for any car with one license plate of any one province to drive in any other province. So he was effectively limiting communication and interaction between his own people. So what this actually achieves is that there is no common identity, there is no trust, there is no empathy between the Kurds of the north, the Shia of the south, Sunnis of the west. So each city is by itself. And therefore, if any one group, if any one ethnicity or religious group wants to rise against the oppression, it's very easy to crack down on them militarily, because no one else would stand with them. They can simply accuse them of being terrorists, vandalizers, traitors, receiving funds from enemy states. So it's very easy, for example, to go to the Kurdish region and just oppress them. So we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to build trust between communities, between people, so that we have a say in influencing decision makers. Next slide, please. So these are some tactics. These are your European and American tactics. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury yet in the Middle East. The theory, the strategic theory behind these tactics, they're called street tactics of nonviolent direct action, is that a few group of activists can interrupt public order. They can boycott, they can sabotage, they can block a building using different nonviolent tools. These things in their arms are called arm tubes, pipes made of plastic, sometimes supported with concrete. On their necks, if you see, there are bike locks, D-locks, and they're linked to the door. So what this happens is once the police show up on the scene, what can the police do? They can't remove them by force. It's impossible unless they want to kill them. And by killing them, it would be too expensive politically for the police. So the strategy of nonviolent activists is make oppression very expensive on the oppressor until you force them to change their tactics. In the Middle East, we still can't do this because we would be easily be killed, and so we can't afford doing these nice ideas yet. We still have to find other mechanisms. So from the Middle East, I have a few pictures from different countries. This is Syria, this is Daria. I will not talk much about Syria because we have a colleague from Syria who will discuss it more. But activists in the early days of the revolution, this is Daria, they actually used flowers and bottles of water when approaching troops to send the message that you are not the enemy, you're our countrymen, we just have righteous demands. Other people just used songs. A famous singer, Brahim al-Ashous, was actually kidnapped, killed, and had his voice box removed by the regime forces. It was that brutal, and the punishment for raising your voice against the regime was that harsh. So one of the tactics used in Syria, they used something called kashush radios. Simple a speaker linked to an MP3 player, linked to a stopwatch, and since they would be killed if they were protesting, they would go to a public space, install the whole thing in a secretive way, set the timer, and just escape. And a few minutes later, you would have loud chants against the regime from the Ashoush song, which says, "Ya irhal ya Bashar, time to leave Bashar." Next slide, please. Other examples, this is from Damascus. One of the tactics of the regime was to separate cities and so that they wouldn't feel empathy towards each other. So if they're bombing Homs, people in Damascus would not know what's happening. So activists snuck into this famous roundabout in Damascus when there was no violent warfare happening in that city in particular. And they secretly colored the water of the pond with red dye. So people woke up the next day and they just saw a huge pool of blood. And that sent a message and wake up, support us, your fellow citizens are dying in the same country. Next slide, please. Coming to Lebanon, Lebanon is more complex politically because we don't have one dictator and one people. We are a post-civil war country. We have 7 leaders and 18 different sects, and there's no trust between them. So instead of having a horizontal division between dictator and people, we have a vertical division, like leader, people, in different styles. So next slide, please. One of our tactics over the years was to try to change that division of power. We were trying to unite people under a secular umbrella, a civil society umbrella, and convince them that you are one group who have no rights against a group of politicians who claim to be different, but they are actually allies who are stealing the country's resources. Next slide, please, as well. So one of our tactics was we tried to compile pictures of all the members of the parliament on one poster. And we devised a non-violent weapon to face them, which is tomatoes. Because culturally, it was quite embarrassing for a member of the parliament to be hit with a tomato. It's not violent, it's not too violent. They would get filthy. So moving on. So this was, next slide, please. So this was downtown Beirut. At one point, a few years ago, the parliament decided to cancel elections altogether, postpone elections under the excuse that the situation isn't stable enough in the country, which was a very bogus excuse. So we used this to confront them. Next slide as well, please. So yeah, this is me in the unfortunate situation of trying to stop a member of the parliament from reaching parliament to vote on cancelling the elections, and are not reckless. These are tactics we're well trained upon: how to sit, how to block, how to resist arrest using non-violent tactics. And in my right hand there, I had an egg, which I ended up throwing at the windshield. We did not succeed in stopping them from cancelling the elections, but we made it very expensive politically and on the media. Next slide, please. So some examples from Palestine, and also Jonathan is probably more knowledgeable about the issue. But in Palestine, some of the non-violent tactics that have been used is against the illegal settlements happening in the West Bank. Palestinian non-violent activists would go and build new villages on their own land as an act of resistance and disobedience towards the Israeli army. So this is Bab al-Shams, a famous example, and they would just build a simple village, and they would just camp out there and make it very difficult for the Israelis to remove. And if they remove them, they would have international supporters, international activists, media coverage, and it would raise the issue again for public debate. Next slide, please. So also, recently there has been another case of Al-Khan al-Ahmar, a village next to Jerusalem that the army wanted to remove. So these are Palestinian activists. This is a friend, Salah al-Khawaja, trying to stop the bulldozer with his bare body. So regarding Palestine, I have something also to add. We have this interesting publication that you will find on the website of the foundation. And it's called Yes to Resistance, No to Violence. So it's a case for non-violent resistance in Palestine, and it's comparing between the first and second Intifada. It's interesting. I would advise you to download it and read it. Okay, so how is all this linked to who I am and what I'm doing here? There has been a sense in the Middle East that violent people are plenty and they are powerful. They receive the best military trainings, they receive the funds of external other countries, like Iran would support Hezbollah, KSA would support other extreme militant groups. So why are the extremists, why are the violent people professionally trained and non-violent activists are amateurs? Why should we say amateurs? We should be strong enough to get back our rights. So the idea of creating a university popped up. And the founders are the people in the lower two pictures, Ogarit Yunan and Walid Staibi. They are prominent activists since the 80s. And basically, they are both PhD holders. So they decided to gather their experience, link with international allies. Like we have the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi on board, French philosophers, Nobel Peace Prize winners. They're all part of the team. And for the first time in the history of the Middle East, we have a university the aim of it isn't purely academical. The university is just a method, a way to empower nonviolent activists, and it aims to play a role in social change. So usually this university, it offers different master's courses, and I would invite you to also check it, the website online. They range from mediation and conflict resolution and negotiation, like how to solve conflicts internally among different people using nonviolent means. It has a component for school teachers. How can you use nonviolence in pedagogy to manage a classroom? Because if a teacher uses violence against children, and they often do in the Middle East, then that child is likely to be either a bully or someone who's submissive. And neither is a good option. So how to manage a classroom in a better way, you can learn that at the university. And of course, most importantly, is how can you use nonviolence strategically for social change? So how can you put a strategy, how can you advocate, how can you lobby, how can you use the tactics? And it all comes together as a very innovative and genuine attempt for deep and effective social change in the Middle East. So we have countries like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, they all attend classes in that university. And we're very excited on the long-term prospects of this project. Thank you for your time, and have a good conference.
Thank you very much. Welcome. I had meant to introduce you, but you were
too fast.
You did your job of self-introduction very well. We have a couple of minutes, and I would like to just go straight into the substance of the matter. And I have two questions actually for you. You work for a university, which means that you also analyze the results and the impact of your strategies and your activities. So tell us a little bit about how you measure the effect of your strategies. And I say that because, of course, something that you probably will hear very often, nonviolence is not effective, and how can we save lives if we go out in the street and throw tomatoes? So tell us a little bit about the effectivity and how you measure that.
Well, in nonviolence, we don't throw tomatoes. It's not that simple. There's a whole process that goes on behind it. First, you analyze what the problem is, what your goal is, who are the players, who are the stakeholders, you do a power mapping, who is your ally, who's your opponent, who's powerful, who's not, how can you influence each party. So there's a whole strategy that goes into the actual work. And eventually, you design a message and a tactic and a plan to intervene. So it has many layers. In Lebanon, between 1975 and 1990, as I mentioned, we had a civil war that never really ended in a resolution. There was no reconciliation, it just ended, people stopped discussing it and moved on. And to this day, we still have a very challenging system. For example, my government is divided among different religious groups. There's a power sharing system. 3 seats for the Sunnis, 3 seats for the Shias, 4 for the Christians, and so on and so on. So whenever you want to hold, let's say, a prime minister or a minister of finance, for example, accountable, it's very hard to do so because if we attack him in the media, then he would say, you're attacking the Sunnis because he's representing the Sunni community in the government. So within that context, we have to think of very smart messages. We have to build trust among other communities. We have to create common platforms. And I think one of the measures of success is over the last decade, for the first time maybe in the last 50 or 60 years, we are beginning to have an emerging sub-scene in Lebanon, which is the secular scene. So we have people running for municipal elections and winning. We have secular clubs popping up in universities. We have people for the first time ever, maybe 2 years ago this happened, 100,000 people protested against a government, and no one political party or religious group called for that protest. It was independent. So we're growing in numbers and we're learning how to organize. So that's one lesson we're learning in Lebanon. Another thing I can mention is that a big issue is not just politics, it's pedagogy, what goes on in schools. So effectively, the university is offering free scholarships for teachers of schools to join and learn how to use nonviolent tactics in pedagogy. So right now we're forming a coalition of nonviolent schools, and we even succeeded in lobbying to introduce nonviolence as a course in the Public University of Lebanon. So these things will lead somewhere eventually.
I guess one of the most important things of nonviolence is the visibility. How do you... It only is effective if it's visible to the world or to the country or to a widest range of people.
Absolutely. I'm going to share with you plans for a future action plan. We haven't done it yet, but we will. And just to see how the logic of nonviolent activism would follow. In Lebanon, we have a problem with racism. Several of our swimming pools do not allow black people to swim in them. And particularly black people from poor countries. We have a big population in Lebanon that's domestic workers who come from Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, maybe the Philippines. They're usually young women who work in households as maids. So swimming pools do not allow these individuals to use the pools because many Lebanese customers are racist and they feel that they are better than that and they will not accept it. So suppose we want to change that. How would we go about it as nonviolent activists? So the first thing we would think, of course, we would try dialogue with the owner of the swimming pool. Most likely, they would not change their minds. So what's next? So we have to force them to change their minds. So we have to think, what are their interests? What do they benefit from? And how can I push their interests? So of course, the obvious answer is money, economics. If you affect the pool owner's profits, he is likely to change his mind. The next question is how can you effectively boycott the place? We can't just 10 of us boycott. It won't be effective. So we need the media to communicate the message to a large number of people. And then the question would be, how can you attack the media? Can you have a press conference that we don't like this? And it's very boring, no one would care. So then the idea would come, why not go non-violently occupy the place? And for example, we can have a non-violent commandos that's well-trained, non-violently completely. And they can go and actually have one of those black Asian women or African woman forcefully not forcefully, she would step in and swim, and activists would protect her, and someone would have a megaphone in the swimming pool, someone would be distributing flyers, someone would have a camera that's filming the whole thing. And this is called a dilemma action. You're forcing your opponent. If they allow you to do so, they would lose, and if they force you to stop it, they would lose. And you would use this momentum in the media to create debate in public opinion, to call for a massive boycott, to affect their profits, to force their policy. So that's the approach we would follow.
Mm-hmm. One last question, because as already was announced, we have only time for short interviews, unfortunately, because I think we could go on for hours. One last question, and that's, I guess, a difficult question about the combination violent response and non-violent response to human rights violations or chaos or big misery. What would be more and more you see there in the world we have humanitarian interventions with military aspects and non-military aspects. Could you say a little bit about your ideas from the non-violent movement on that phenomenon?
Well, when it comes to peace, there's something we define as negative peace, and then there's something called positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of direct violence, so no one is shooting at someone else, but it doesn't mean that there's actual peace. There wouldn't be trust or cooperation or any system or any rights. The alternative will be positive peace, to actually have these things in place. So I would say I do not believe in mixed tactics, violent and non-violent. I would have some sympathy for peacekeeping missions, like having a peace force that's just separating groups till you have a political resolution. However, the peacemaking or the peace enforcement efforts, I don't find them very, even the term itself, peace enforcement, you're forcing someone to have peace. I don't think it really works. I think instead there should be more understanding of the root causes of conflict. Who are the people having conflict? What are their interests? What's the history? What are the grievances? And how can you effectively respond to those root causes?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. It will be something, a topic that will come back in other interviews later this afternoon. For the moment, I thank you very much for your presentation and for answering these few questions.
My pleasure.